Happy New Year to all of you. Throughout the years, the church really doesn't know what to do, or didn't know what to do, and still doesn't know what to do with January 1st. And it's kind of interesting because when I was a kid, January 1st was the feast of the circumcision of Jesus. That used to create problems, especially when kids would come home from church and start asking interesting questions. They made it the Solemnity of Mary shortly after, after Vatican II. And then they also said you can celebrate the World Day of Peace on this particular feast. So we'll take the Solemnity of Mary, since it's the one that most will be used, and the readings from that Solemnity of Mary for today. The first reading is from the book of Numbers. Yahweh said to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and tell them, this is how you shall bless the Israelites. Say to them, Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh look upon you kindly and give you peace. So shall they invoke my name upon the Israelites, and I will bless them." Word of the Lord. The second reading is from Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 4. Brothers and sisters, when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to ransom those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons and daughters. As proof that you are sons and daughters, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying out, "Abba, Father." So you are no longer a slave but a child, and if a child, then also an heir through God. Word of the Lord. The gospel reading is one that carries on from the Eucharist at midnight reading from Luke chapter 2. The shepherds went in haste to Bethlehem and found Mary and Joseph and the infant lying in a manger. When they saw this, they made known the message that had been told them about this child. All who heard it were amazed by what had been told them by the shepherds. Mary kept all these things, reflecting on them in her heart. Then the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, just as it had been told to them. When 8 days were completed for his circumcision, he was named Jesus, the name given him by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. It's always difficult when we have a feast of Mary because we know almost nothing about the historical Mary of Nazareth. Each evangelist uses her for a different way of conveying his theology or his idea about disciples of Jesus. If it wasn't for Luke, we'd probably have nothing about Mary that we could utilize, especially in our liturgies or in our private devotions. Luke is the one who made a lot about Mary, much more than any of the other three evangelists. As a matter of fact, the very first evangelist, Mark, refers to her in chapter 3 as someone who didn't even understand her son. Remember that famous passage where Jesus' relatives were going to leave, take him in charge, because they thought he was out of his mind. And then there's an interruption of that particular event by the Beelzebub story about people claiming that Jesus was casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub that he had in him. And then we get back again to the original story. It says his mother and his brothers then arrived. That means Mark presumed his mother, among other people, also thought he was simply some mental case. I am certain if all we had was Mark's gospel, we'd have no St. Mary's churches anyplace. When people would bring up his mother, they would simply shake their heads and say, "Too bad, even his own mother didn't understand him." But Luke's quite different. Luke, for instance, uses Mary in his gospel as the example of the perfect disciple. And for him, the perfect disciple simply is someone who hears God's word and carries it out. That's why almost always in that gospel, whenever Mary comes on the scene, there's something about listening to God, something about carrying out God's word. It's like a theme that he plays. I, like all of you, was much impressed with John Williams' score for the old movie Jaws. And the ostinato, new word that I learned recently, that he employs whenever the shark's around. Remember that two-note thing? Da, 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 da. And whenever we hear that particular set of notes, we start thinking, uh-oh, the shark's here, we're in trouble, something's bad's going to happen. In a parallel but quite different way, in Luke's gospel, whenever Mary comes on the scene, we automatically know Luke's going to play his theme about her. He's going to bring up her perfect discipleness, as it were. And so today, for instance, in the gospel, she's somebody who, when the shepherds come and start talking about what they had experienced with the angels and things, she starts to reflect. As anybody who hears God's word and carries it out, reflection becomes a very key element. It's really interesting because later in chapter 11, that definition of Mary is expressed very explicitly. Remember in that chapter, the woman yells from the crowd, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you." And Luke's Jesus, following Luke's theme, rejoins back to that woman, remember, and he says, "Blessed rather are those who hear God's word and carry it out." And so that's the theme that we have to be very conscious of today if we're going to celebrate anything that has to do with Mary and we employ Luke's gospel. It's nice to know, for instance, what Paul says in the Galatians reading, that second reading today, one of the few historical mentions about Mary, without even mentioning her name, that Jesus of Nazareth was born of a woman. A very consoling thing for all of us to know. He didn't just float down from heaven. But at the same time, he was born of a Jewish woman, and Paul stresses that. He was born under the law. And most of the time, whenever we see pictures of statues of Mary, she does not look like a first century BCE Jewish woman. She usually looks like some medieval person or some Western European, somebody who has blue eyes, usually long blonde hair, sometimes even, totally different from any particular makeup of a Jewish woman, especially a young teenage girl from the first century BCE. That was not Mary. Mary didn't hear God's voice that she carried out. She didn't hear that voice in a church. She didn't hear that voice by reading a gospel. She heard that voice in a synagogue. She heard that voice when she lit the Sabbath candles every Friday night. She heard that voice basically when she read or was basically listened to the Hebrew Scriptures, something which we people today, if we are Gentile Christians, almost never do. That's why we have to understand that when Luke says she heard God's voice, he's telling his particular readers, who are Gentiles, that they also, and we today in hearing Luke, should be very conscious of how God's voice comes to us in many different ways, many different circumstances. Just like she heard that voice in her culture, in her environment, we're constantly listening for that voice today. It isn't something that only comes in religious situations or religious environments. That voice of God is something day in, day out that's part of our life if we know what to listen for. Carol Stuhmiller used to always stress that the best definition in the Hebrew Scriptures of a disciple of God pardon me, was in the third song of the suffering servant in Deutero-Isaiah, where the prophet says, "Every morning Yahweh wakes me to hear." And Stuhmiller used to stress that when it says after that he opens my ear, Yahweh does, the word for open in other parts of the Hebrew Scriptures is employed when they talk about drilling out a well. It isn't that we have an overabundance of earwax. We just simply don't know what it's like to be trained, to be disciples, to be listeners more than anything else. Because if we don't listen, we're not really carrying out God's word. If we don't listen, If we don't experience that word as part of our lives, I don't know what type of Christianity we would live. It's certainly not the type of Christianity Mary lived, certainly not the Christianity that Jesus lived, and certainly not the Christianity that he wished his disciples to imitate. That's why when we hear that reading, from Numbers about that very well-known blessing of Aaron, as I said before, originally that was a fertility blessing. People were asking God through that blessing to make sure they were fertile, that they had children, enough children to take care of them, to expand, and enough flocks that they were able to make a living off of it, enough bushel per acre in their fields. But it is something that gave them security. Yahweh was the one who brought that about. I don't know that we need that type of fertility today, but we certainly need the peace and the tranquility that even Moses was talking about when he stressed that concept of Aaron's blessing. If we did that, then we could only be people who listen to God and, like Luke says, carry out what God wishes us to do. Thanks a lot. Have a good year.